You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 4, Arson, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 20. Women Troubles.
Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to tame a female dragon. This is of limited risk, as they are vastly less numerous than male dragons, and have only ever been found as juveniles living near low-lying lakes. The author cannot expand on the specifics of why known taming techniques do not work on females, as there are no surviving witnesses to provide data.
Merle looked around his room, gesturing to various piles of collected junk, to his small single bed, to his long and uneven hair which he'd probably cut himself, and ultimately to his person as a whole.
"You're asking me about women troubles," he said. "You must be awful desperate."
Kuro didn't want to say that he was, as it felt rude, but that was the truth of the matter. He had made other inquiries, but had come up empty. People in the lodge were all but unanimous in their assertion that it must be Marie. Their fiery and forbidden romance was in all the papers, after all. The few who knew better knew nothing. Sean and Gregory, his most trusted advisors on matters of romance due to their long and successful relationship of nearly 2 years, could offer only condolences. Whoever it was didn't want him to know, and everyone believing that he and Marie fancied each other would probably just drive her deeper into hiding while she pined. They explained there was an unwritten rule in the practice of courtship among the lower classes that the person being courted should have absolutely no idea that it's happening. They blamed romance novels. The books propagated the idea that desire blossomed through adversity and that true love would always find a way. So aspirants created as many obstacles for themselves as possible and then sat around hoping. Kuro envied the royal method, where folk clearly and plainly stated their intentions. Laurent Rocamadour might have been a ridiculous twit, but at least he was straightforward. Then an ache in Kuro's shoulder reminded him of the duels, and he considered that this romantic shell game might be something of a safety precaution. Running out of people willing to talk to him, he'd brought some scones and questions to Merle. He was at least fairly old, and with that could have come some degree of wisdom. "How can you tell if a girl likes you?" asked Kuro, sliding a pawn forward to free his bishop.
"Well, in my considerable experience in that field..."
Merle paused while he pondered which knight to ruin Kuro's plans with.
"They don't."
He continued as they played out the game, which had been decided before the first piece had moved.
"Haven't had any luck with women folk, but in all honesty, I've never found one worth making the effort. One'll come along someday who'll knock my socks off, big and strong as the day is long, and I'll woo her right and proper. But it hasn't happened yet. I'm a man of discerning taste."
Kuro chose to ignore the collection of discarded junk that surrounded them. "I'm not trying to woo anyone. I think someone's trying to do it to me, but they won't tell me they're doing it."
"Oh, that's a trick, isn't it?"
Merle tapped the side of his nose and winked.
"Folks'll pine for months, moaning and fainting and all that, but act all cool and calm the moment their flame shows up. Seen a lot of that sort of thing in my time here."
"Do you know who it is then? You must overhear a lot of stuff."
"Oh sure, I hear all sorts of things," Merle agreed. "Don't much listen though. The students are bad enough as it is without me knowing all their thoughts and feelings. I'd soon as not chuck 'em off a cliff rather than hear whose hand who held and what not. Besides, they're kids. It ain't proper for a fellow of my vintage to go eavesdropping."
Kuro accepted that as being a disappointingly reasonable stance for Merle to take. He turned his mind back to chess and settled in for his inevitable defeat. "Hey, wait a minute," he said, re-examining the board. "You could have had me in checkmate in 3 moves. Why did you move your rook?" Merle smiled. It was a smile full of crooked and stained teeth, and it appeared unpracticed. The man was permanently grouchy.
"You noticed," he said. "Good on you. You wouldn't have a month ago."
"Were you playing worse on purpose?" asked Kuro.
"Oh, maybe a bit," admitted Merle. "Can't go thrashing you too bad all the time. You're still learning. And also, I like the scones. Might not come back if I don't give you a bit of hope."
"Well, I guess I've lost," said Kuro, leaving his seat and heading for the window. "Thanks for the advice. You can keep the rest of the tray." Kuro didn't tell the man that he had 2 more trays of baking in his bag. He was merely the first stop in unraveling the mystery. There wasn't much hope in the next stop, but it was one he had to make anyway, and who could say what a dragon might know? "The scones are very fine, baker," said Maripogo, "and I don't recall ever being given jalapeno and artichoke jelly. It is—" She licked her lips and considered her opinion of it. "Fascinating. As for your question, has this girl climbed to the highest peak and let out a bellow of calling to draw males to her?"
No," said Kuro. "I don't think so."
"Then she is not in season for the mating. If she is seeking you now, it can only be to test your mettle, or perhaps to cull you as a weakling unworthy of the contest. I would not be surprised if it is the latter. You are small and clever. We prefer our males large, ferocious, and stupid."
"I don't think wizards work that way," said Kuro. He was less certain of that fact than he wanted to be.
"They are strange creatures," said his dragon. He'd gotten used to the pathetically dim light in the cave enough to navigate on his own, which meant Shingle had let him hand over his baking himself. It wasn't out of kindness. Getting close enough to a mouth that large was nerve-wracking. The dragon was coiled twice around the cave, so he had to climb on her to even get to her face, then toss baked goods into a maw like a toothy train tunnel. Being so close to the event, he noticed her chewing on the scone he'd given her, which should have been nothing more than a crumb in a mouth that size.
"How come you can eat the food I make?" he asked. "Isn't it too small for you?"
"Size is a malleable thing," she said. "I am as big as I know myself to be. The food I eat is the size it should be for one so grand as I." That made enough sense for Kuro. He understood that he couldn't understand, which was becoming a more and more comfortable state to occupy. Also, it confirmed that he didn't have to make dragon-sized portions, which he'd always worried about. Another concern struck him, however, as he looked at the many mounds of gold in which baby dragons baked. He might not need to make bigger things, but he may need to start cooking bigger batches if more dragons were on their way.
"Are the eggs gonna hatch soon?" he asked.
"Quite soon, I think. Any time," Maripogo said with some eagerness. "Certainly within the next century, perhaps the next decade. I cannot know for certain, but I am eager to meet my children and taste the sky once more." What soon meant to a dragon older than civilization was difficult to comprehend. Shingle reappeared to bring him back to the lodge. She'd become, well, not exactly friendly, but at least tolerant of Kuro. Every time he didn't try to steal treasure or turn a dragon egg into some kind of giant omelet, she saw him a little less as a wizard or monster. If nothing else, that meant she didn't leave him in locked broom closets or waist-deep in swamps anymore. He said goodbye to his dragon, and they blinked into the lodge kitchen to help with dinner preparations. Something was wrong about the blink. It took twice as long as normal and felt inside out. Doubling the duration of instantaneous still took no time at all, but it was a sluggish and effortful nothing, like how the last second of class takes longer than all the rest. Also, it felt like they took a detour on the way, not an extra stop, just that they took the scenic route through nowhere before arriving at the expected somewhere. As he gathered his thoughts and took in his surroundings, he noticed a couple more oddities. The most pressing was the attention he was drawing from the Luton for being nearly naked in the kitchen. He had only his book bag, sneakers, and boxer shorts. Also, there was no they. Shingle was missing. She was not absent for long. She appeared in roughly the time it would take a Luton to gather a pile of clothes and check multiple locations around the island, which is to say hardly any time at all. She grabbed his arm and yanked him to his room in a rather forceful blink.
What did you do?
She demanded, though it was more of an accusation. I think I teleported, said Kuro, too shocked to overthink it.
What kind of wizard trickery is that supposed to be?
I mean blinking, he said.
You can't blink,
stated Shingle like absolute fact.
You're a wizard.
I'm not really, said Kuro, any more than I am a Luton, and I think I just did.
Why did you leave most of your clothes behind?
She threw the pile at him. I don't think I'm very good at it, said Kuro.
I've never heard of such a thing. You cannot be good or bad at blinking. It's just something you do. It's easier than breathing, and you don't blink.
It was equally an order and a statement of fact. She left. He stared at the clothes in puzzlement. Why had only some of his clothes stayed behind? Dr. Emeris's book said something about knowing the extent of his body, understanding where you started and stopped. But he still had his bag even though it was farther away from his actual skin than anything else. The socks really puzzled him. How had he teleported with his shoes but not his socks? The answer became obvious when he allowed himself to listen to his feelings rather than his thoughts. Those shoes were his. They were the ones given to him by Mr. Schumacher back in his days on the street. They had been enchanted to grow with him and be extra durable, though after years of rough use, the soles were wearing thin. They were almost a part of him. The socks were not. They were new, fresh out of the package. The orphanage had sent them along with the new uniform clothes after his duels. They were new, but his underwear was not. He hadn't had to open the pack of new boxers yet, a fact for which he was suddenly very grateful. He'd worn the uniform plenty, but he never felt at home in a shirt and tie. That was a costume. Underpants, though, he only had to wear once before they were forever and truly his, as was the way for anyone. The things that teleported with him were only what he considered his. That posed a bit of a problem, but less than piggybacking on Autolycus did. At least he wasn't completely naked. He tried to repeat the process, but something was missing. In the dragon's cavern, he had known he was about to blink. That felt important. Expecting it to happen erased the doubts about whether it could. Also, he'd said goodbye. Luton didn't need words, but often wizards did. They carried layers of compounding meanings that helped sculpt thought, or at least that's what his textbook said. He wondered if that mattered, whether he'd accidentally cast a little spell.
Kuro, the ham is burning!
A squeaky little voice from the chopping station down the counter rattled him from his musings and reminded him that the world outside his mind existed. He'd dressed and gone to the kitchen to help with cooking dinner in a bit of a distracted state. Finding he was standing in front of a stove with a spatula in hand, he guessed what job he'd been doing. He flipped the strips of the pink rubbery canned substance in the frying pan that could very generously be called ham. They were only slightly blackened. The seaweed wrap would disguise it. He did his best to focus on cooking. There were simply too many things vying for his attention lately. He couldn't keep them all in his head. Every time something new entered, it pushed something else out. He tried to run through the list of obligations without forgetting about the fry pan. Near the bottom, he tripped across an almost forgotten promise. Oh dear, he was late. He still had another set of scones to deliver. With hasty apologies, he left the kitchen and collected his winter wear. At a speed achieved only through reckless abandon and a gale-forced tailwind, he flew to the docks. Ms. McCutcheon had not waited. He didn't blame her. He was unreliable, and she had worked a full day putting up with junior high students. A person's patience could be asked to stretch only so far. He donned his winter clothes and pulled his baking from his bag so it would not be trapped once he crossed the Vale. He left the gentle spring of fairy realm Avalon into the brutal winter of the Blandlands. The trail to Danny's cottage was face-splittingly, bone-achingly, teeth-chatteringly cold in the way only a wet December wind off Hudson Bay can be. At the end, though, was a promise of a cozy quilt, a warm fire, hot tea, and his cat. By the time he arrived, he wasn't certain his toes were still attached to his feet, and his fists were balled so tightly in his mittens he wasn't sure he'd ever uncurl them. Fists were good enough for knocking on a door, though. He was welcomed by the joyful and childlike smile of Danny, keeper of his cat, researcher of birds, partner of the principal, and friend. He visited her too rarely. She led him into her little cabin, the only bland-side building on the island. It was filled, as always, with books, soft light, and the smell of cedar. Not at all like always, it was also full to bursting with people. That didn't take a lot for a cabin that could comfortably seat two, but Kuro nearly staggered back out into the cold rather than face the crowd. Crammed into the small living room were Danny and Ms. McCutcheon, which made sense because they lived there, Sam, who visited often enough but typically only when the principal was working late, Ms. Crawley, who he knew was going to be president because he had let slip that Scones would be there as well, a half-blind, half-deaf grey tabby cat, and 3 royal sartorialists. For everyone to fit, they were spilling out of the room. Sam leaned in the doorway to the kitchen. Ms. Crawley perused the bookshelves. Principal McCutcheon occupied an ottoman, and Danny took up residence on top of the dining table. That left 3 of the 4 chairs in the house for the other guests. The final chair, the coziest of the lot, was held by a sleeping cat whom nobody had the bravery to disturb. She had grown fat and pampered, but her claws remembered the streets. Startling her from sleep was a good way to require medical attention. Her being deaf, it was difficult to avoid startling her. Everyone smiled a greeting. They were gentle, friendly, and deeply ominous smiles. Something about being the smallest person in the room, by at least a foot in a decade, was unsettling, as was the unexpected presence of the Norns. He didn't like it. "You know Emily, Janice, and Tina, don't you, Kuro?" Sam said, reintroducing the Weavers, who apparently had first names. "Of course," said Kuro, trying hard to appear happy to see them. He presented a paper bag stuffed with scones, his intended offering to the occupants of the house, but instead offered an apology. "I didn't know there would be extra people. I'm not sure I brought enough." He opened the bag and counted. There were exactly 8. White gave a smirk. Had they rewoven the strands of fate, altered the destiny of the cosmos, just to make sure they'd get a fresh scone? He wouldn't put it past them. He distributed them with a warning about the jelly. "It's a Luton-style recipe," he explained. "A bit of an acquired taste." Most opted for butter. "Hey, Gray, I brought you something." He laid a thin strip of the ham-like substance he'd been frying on the chair in front of her nose. A few sniffs, and the sleeping cat was awake and licking the salty pink substance. He scritched her ears and lifted her aside to share her chair with her. The others looked at him like he'd done witchcraft, having moved the cat without coming out bleeding. "What did you call her?" asked Black. Gray," said Kuro. "It's her name." She seemed to find that amusing. The others did too, but not all at the same time. Maybe in the Blandlands their connection was severed. Alternately, they were pretending to be normal people, which they'd made no effort to do in his company. His distrust of the trio grew. It wasn't that he thought they were up to something nefarious, just that they were definitely up to something. They had plans that he was a part of but couldn't comprehend. Whatever he did, it was playing into their hands. Probably anyway. They might have just been there for the scones. He warmed himself in his chair by the fire and let himself vanish into the background, while the adult women chatted happily about adult women things. That was a drifting conversation without purpose or direction. It washed from complaints about aches and pains to complaints about students and colleagues. Rumor and gossip intermingled with book recommendations and philosophical musings. They, for a time, appeared to forget he existed. That is, until, as if by design, it drifted to romance and to him. "And of course I'm flattered, but I'm much too busy to even think of being interested," said Red, referring to some nice young man on the Summerhill staff who was hopelessly infatuated with her. You know what that's like, don't you, Kuro? 7 pairs of eyes turned on him. When he failed to either melt through the chair or suddenly have his first intentional self-powered blink, he replied with an insightful and contemplative, "Huh?" "Your admirer," said Red, as if that clarified something. "Do you mean Marie?" he said, expecting another bout of people insisting that they must be secret lovers. Instead, the room burst with laughter at the suggestion. That was somehow worse than the people who kept telling him that the two must be in love. They weren't, but it wasn't laughable that they could be. All right, it was, but it still wasn't nice to do it to his face. Ms. Crawley was the first to show sympathy. "I think Her Majesty has other things on her mind than romance right now, and she quite values you as a friend." That was a very delicate way of telling him he had less of a chance with her than of beating Mere Pogo in an arm wrestle. "I know. She complains a lot about all the people trying to woo her. Do you know she got a marriage proposal in the mail this week from a 7-year-old? But everyone else reads the papers and believes we're engaged in sordid liaisons. I don't even know what that is." Ms. Crawley seemed relieved that she hadn't broken his heart. "I'm glad you know better. I fear your admirer doesn't." "Do you know who it is? Charlie seems to think there's someone but won't tell me." Kuro slurped his tea slowly and looked wide-eyed at the others in hopes they would fill in the blank. "You don't know?" said Black in surprise. "You must know," said Sam, disbelieving the innocent bewilderment before her. "Know what?" asked Kuro, genuinely baffled. "Even I know," said Danny, who was a pure Blandlander and couldn't enter the fairy realm. Kuro shot an accusing glare at Ms. McCutcheon, who shrugged, but not with innocence. It was more of a refusal to take any sort of criticism for sharing such common knowledge. "It's almost painful to watch," said Sam, finally taking some kind of pity on him and starting to explain. "She's usually so smart and confident, but the poor girl goes absolutely to pieces around you. You must have noticed." How could he have noticed if he was always around when it happened? "I have not." "Really?" asked Red. "Truly?" asked Black. "Genuinely?" asked White. "Everyone just thought you were trying to let her down gently," said Sam. "You know, show some polite disinterest." "Who?" asked Kuro, startling the cat with the vigor of his demand and earning a claw in his leg for the effort. There was a pause as the women engaged in a silent argument about whether he should be told and who should be the one to tell him. "It really isn't our place to say," said Ms. McCutcheon in her authoritative, teacherly way. "It is her business, and it would be inappropriate of us to meddle in such things." That seemed conclusive. Nods of agreement and some apologetic murmurs circled the room. That is, until Red, hiding a foxy smirk behind her teacup, said, "It's Azalea Lamorak." It was a tone that left no room for question of the authenticity of the statement. It was fact, indisputable as arithmetic, regardless of the apparent impossibility. He tried to comprehend what she'd said as the room around him burst into laughter and accusations of impropriety. It wasn't that he didn't think she fancied him. It was more that he had never imagined that she could fancy him, or anyone else for that matter. He was a short, grubby, strange-faced, half-human criminal. The closest thing he had to a redeeming quality was his ability to bake a decent pie. At a complete and utter loss, he turned to the women and asked a knotty and tangled question that he hoped their collective wisdom could unpick. "Why?"
Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.